Hello everybody and welcome to this video. So today I'm going to be showing you guys some opening traps in a very popular opening at all levels from beginner to master called the Ruy Lopez opening, which you may also know as the Spanish opening. This starts with the moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6 and bishop to b5. Some of the lines that I will show you today will be traps, so we'll be trying to provoke a mistake out of our opponent by playing something aggressive or looking for some sort of attack. And other things that I will show you will be more where we're sort of punishing beginner mistakes. So mistakes that a lot of people might make at the lower level or even at the higher level sometimes. So it's a good idea to always be on the lookout for some of these tactics that may come up in your games. So let's get started with this opening and what it involves. So the Ruy Lopez opening starts like this, as I've shown you, and basically the idea of the opening is to put pressure on this knight on c6 using our bishops on b5, and we are threatening to capture and double their pawns on the c file if we feel like this is a good choice. Another thing that we do with the move bishop b5 is that we add some extra pressure to this pawn in the center. You'll notice that we played knight f3 to attack the e5 pawn, and our opponent played knight c6 to defend the e5 pawn. When we play bishop to b5, we indicate that we may threaten to take this knight on c6, and then this pawn on e5 would be hanging. But one thing I will get you guys to note if you are just learning this opening is that a lot of the time in the opening, you can't actually capture this pawn, even though it looks like a threat. For example, if your opponent plays something like bishop to c5 here, which is a common move, and you go, hey, they just hung this pawn in the center, so I'm going to take. Your opponent can take like this, and after knight takes e4, this is actually a blunder due to the move queen d4. And here, your opponent is attacking the e4 pawn, they're attacking f7, and they're also attacking your knight. So you're in quite a bit of trouble here. After you retreat your knight back this way, they can capture your pawn in the center. So this is something that you want to watch out for. You don't want to get into this mistake in the opening. But anyway, let's move on and start talking about the traps that we have for white. So we're going to start with the most common response for, one of the most common responses for black. I'm not sure if this is actually the most common. It's the second most common, which is knight to f6. And this is known as the Berlin defense. I'm sure you guys, if you've watched professional chess games, you've probably heard of this before. Very famous opening where a lot of this opening is theory, so a lot of the time people talk about going into a Berlin endgame, which is pretty much known theory, 30 moves in or something like that. So we're going to avoid too much theory here, and instead we're going to look at some traps. So after knight to f6, we are going to castle on the king side. And here, it may look a little silly that we're leaving this e4 pawn hanging, but this is something that you should know that if you're learning the Ruy Lopez opening, is that a lot of the times you can leave this e4 pawn hanging because we're going to get a lot of pressure down the e-file in return for that pawn that we're temporarily giving up, and we'll almost always earn it back. If your opponent decides they want to be greedy and take a pawn, don't be too afraid because we're going to respond with the move rook to e1. And here we're going to attack the knight, and once the knight is moving, you'll notice that we have a lot of pressure on this pawn in the center, and soon we'll be able to capture it. Now, something that people might do at the beginner level is try and hold on to this pawn. So they might go, okay, I want to keep my knight in the center, and I want to hold on to this pawn, and I want to play bishop to c5 next move and target the f2 pawn. So, common response you might see is f5 here. So here, when your opponent plays f5, they're probably planning to play something like this and bring their bishop in and try and attack you with the f2 pawn and keep their knight in the center. Here we have a nice idea to try and trap our opponent. We're going to play the move d3, attacking the knight. Now what your opponent should do is return their knight over to f6. And this does just open up the e-file, so we can basically just capture down here. So something that we could do is take on c6 and then take it in the center like this. And something great about this, even though this is the best move for black, we still have a lot of traps. For example, if your opponent decides to go bishop to d7, developing their bishop, we have the nice move knight c6, and this comes with a check, also attacking the queen, so your opponent can basically resign and say good game. So that is the best response, to go knight f6. Something your opponent might do is play the move knight to d6. And this, it makes a lot of sense because we're attacking this bishop that's on b5 here. So a lot of people might think, okay, I guess I have to move my bishop somewhere. But what we're going to do is play something quite surprising and end the game quite quickly. First, we're going to trade on c6. After the pawn captures, we have a very nice move not to capture in the center, even though this is also good, but instead we're going to play something a little more subtle, bishop to g5. And your opponent may not be panicked now, but pretty quickly they'll realize that their queen is starting to run out of squares over on this side. So the queen cannot escape out of this diagonal, and also putting it on the d7 square would just lead to problems after we can capture on e5 with an attack on the queen. So instead, your opponent might just go, okay, I'm going to play bishop e7, let's just trade off our bishops, and this will all be completely fine. So here, what you can do is exploit a pin and play rook takes e5. And here now your opponent is in a lot of trouble. We are threatening to capture on e7 and win a piece, and we are just completely winning here. Your opponent really just has no way to defend this bishop in the center. I mean, they can castle and run away, but we can capture here, attacking both the rook and the queen, and that is pretty much GG's. That is the first line that we're looking at. Let's look at another one. This is with the same line, except this time after rook e1, instead of playing f5, which is something that, you know, your opponent might do if they're feeling a little bit greedy, but a lot of people would not be so brave as to play f5. They instead might decide that they'll go back to d6, which is the best move. And if your opponent's looked at some theory, they might know that knight d6 is the best move here. But still, it is not easy to play. There's a lot of moves that are good here for white, something that if you don't want to go into something trappy or play anything dubious, you can just capture on e5. So just taking on e5 with the knight is completely fine. We can get a trade-off in the center and have some nice control over the e-file and feel pretty happy with this development here. But here I'm going to recommend something a little bit crazy. Here we can go knight to c3. And what we're going to do is defend this bishop over here with this knight and keep the tension in the center so we're not immediately capturing. Your opponent may decide to grab that bishop on b5 because we know that the bishop pair is good and we might as well take it. And what you're going to do is not capture back. You're not going to take back on b5. Instead, you're going to do something again that's very crazy. And you're going to play knight takes e5. And something that you might see a lot, especially at the beginner level, is a big mistake here. Your opponent may think, okay, I'm just up a piece here, and what I'm going to do since I'm up a piece is trade down. So they might go knight to c3. So even if your opponent's calculated this a little bit, they may still think it looks okay. They may have thought, okay, we'll block like this, and then maybe they're going to take my queen, and I'm going to take your queen, and this looks completely fine. After takes and takes, black is just up a piece. But that is not what we're going to do. We are instead going to maybe surprise our opponent. After knight takes c6 and bishop e7, we're going to capture here, not the queen, but we're going to capture the bishop with the knight. And here we have some huge threats. And this comes from the fact that the king is stuck in the center of the board. The queen also doesn't have many squares either. Now, after your opponent takes on d1, taking your queen, they may be expecting you to play knight c6. And here the king can just run to f8 and is completely fine. Instead, we're going to play knight to g6, making sure we control this f8 square and the king cannot escape. Now, the only two moves that black can play are queen to e7 and knight to e3, and both of those ways, we're going to just capture the piece. Now, if they play knight to e3, we're going to take with the rook to keep this attack down the e-file, but it's very unlikely that you'll see that. You'll most likely see queen to e7 here. And while taking over here is okay, we're actually going to take with the knight instead. So the problem with this is after the trade here, our knight is going to be lost. So even after we take on f7, they can capture our knight. And while we will be able to grab this knight eventually because it is trapped, it doesn't actually end up with us being up a lot of material in the endgame, and we want to convert this as cleanly as possible. Instead, we're going to take with the knight. And now the threat is again to play knight g6 with a revealed attack on the rook and also a check on the king. And the knight, if you'll notice, is still trapped over here, so cannot escape. After king d8, we'll capture the bishop that's on c8 since it couldn't move anyway. And then after takes and takes, we're going to be up a piece in the endgame. So this is a big trap that you can use to catch your opponents off guard. Let's look at some of the other traps that we can also fall into. Okay, so if your opponent decides they're not going to play Berlin and instead they're going to play something called the classical defense with bishop c5, let's look at some of the traps that your opponent can fall into with this line. So here we're going to castle the king, get it safe, and now your opponent might play knight g to e7. It's one of the many options that your opponent has, but it's probably one of the more common ones given the fact that you develop the knight over to the e7 square, meaning that now the bishop is no longer threatening to double the pawns. So now if takes, you can take back with the knight here and not have double pawns, and also you prepare the king to castle. So here we're going to play c3, and this is a really common idea in the Ruy Lopez because we are wanting to take over the center. So our plan is going to be to play d4. So it's good to start off with playing c3, so eventually we can prepare to play d4 by building up a pawn chain in the center. Here, if your opponent decides to go a little crazy with the move f5, we're going to punish them for that. f5 looks like a decent idea here. What they're wanting to do is chip away at your center. I mean, if you capture here straight away, what they get to do is they get to start pushing forward with d5 and e4, and they get a big control over the middle of the board. So instead of capturing on f5, which is what our opponent wants, we're going to play the move d4. And after the bishop moves back to b6, we can push forward again with d5. And suddenly you'll notice that we're actually the ones taking over the center. The knight is suddenly running out of squares to go. Your opponent may then decide, okay, I'm going to capture this pawn here before I move my knight, because if takes, I'm going to take over here. Instead, you're going to play a move knight to g5. And here the idea is that we're attacking this e4 pawn, but also attacking the e6 and f7 squares. And after your opponent decides now is the time to move the knight, they're going to be in for a big shock. Because we're going to play the move knight to e6. And here the queen is completely trapped. It has nowhere to go. They can't take here because they're pinned from this bishop to the king. And they're just going to be losing a queen here. So this is a very surprising move that ends up with a trap. And the reason why your opponent would want to move their knight to b8 as opposed to other squares is that they can't move forward here, they can't move to either of these squares, and also if the knight goes to a5, the same problem happens. We have knight e6, again, trapping the queen. So instead of this, the engine recommends that the king should just castle and run away. And after captures, and bishop c4. Apparently, black has compensation for the piece, but I say it's always more fun to play with the piece rather than the pawns here. We've got some double pawns, and I think that you'll be happy to play this position on. So another opening that you could face involves f5 here, and this is known as the Yanish Gambit, also known as the Schliemann variation, I think. I'm probably pronouncing those both wrong, but this is a very annoying gambit to face, I have to say, because if you just capture here, it gets really annoying. Your opponent starts to push pawns forward, take control of the center. You no longer have an e-pawn to play with, so it's just very annoying. Taking the pawn is usually not ending up well for white. Other responses can be knight c3 and d3 and also d4. Here, we're going to play the move knight c3. And the third most common move in this position is to play knight d4. And here the idea is that black wants to trade off their knight that's on c6, which is kind of being a liability for at the moment. It's a target for which we can use to try and double the pawns. And also, if you'll notice here, this knight doesn't really have many good squares that it wants to head to either. So your opponent probably just wants to trade off this knight and then start pushing in the center, because at the moment the knight is also blocking black off from pushing the pawns in the middle. Here, after knight d4, we're going to make sure that we keep our light square bishop on the board and play bishop to c4. After bishop to c4, your opponent has the possibility to make a big mistake here. And it doesn't look that crazy, but it instantly loses. F takes e4, and the position is now winning for white. We can capture this knight here on d4, and now there is a problem for black, which is the result of playing f5 very early in the opening. The king is super weak now along this diagonal, and now the queen is open to give some checks. So if your opponent decides to capture the piece back, we have queen h5 check. And after g6, the queen can come to e5 with a fork of the king and the rook. And after queen e7, queen takes. We can even take over here on g8 as well and be completely winning there. If your opponent instead decides, I'm not going to push this pawn here and lose my rook, I know this trap, I'm going to play king e7 instead, well, they've ended the game faster, but not in a good way, because we have queen e5 checkmate in the middle of the board. So that is another trap that your opponent might fall into. Let's look at another one. This is the most common move that you're going to see against the Ruy Lopez, and this is the move a6. We're going to retreat the bishop and move it back to a4. Now, of course, we can capture here and give our opponent double pawns, but a lot of the time it's nice to just keep this bishop on the board for as long as possible, and eventually we can reroute it to this b3 square where we can start targeting the f7 square from afar. Here, your opponent decides to push forward by playing b5, and we're going to move back to b3, keeping an eye on this pawn over here. Then, bishop c5 is played, trying to put pressure on the f2 pawn in return, and we're going to castle and get the king safe. Here, knight g to e7 is played, preparing to castle, and now we're going to play c3. Once again, similar idea where we're going to push for the d4 break in the center, and try and get two pawns strong in the center. Here, a move that looks logical already loses the game. So your opponent may decide to play d6, and this is a very common move because a lot of the time your opponent will be wanting to develop their bishop out to this diagonal here. They'll want to bring it to the g4 square where they can pin your knight to your queen and sort of stop you from playing d4 in response, because your knight will not be able to defend the d4 square as well when it's pinned. So your opponent may play d6 to open up their bishop, but here we have the move d4. And after takes and takes, the bishop moves back. Knight g5 is just winning for white. So if your opponent decides they're going to be safe if they castle, then they will have some problems to face after queen to h5. Here we have not one, not two, but three attackers on this f7 square, and also with threatening checkmate on h7. So you need to defend both of these threats at once, but it's really just not possible. Here, the only move to defend checkmate here is h6. And after this, we can capture on f7 with the knight. And here we're attacking the queen, and we're threatening to do so with a revealed check on the king, where the bishop will be attacking the king as we take. So your opponent really needs to take on f7 one way or another, because otherwise they're just going to be losing the queen. So here they might capture. We're going to take with the bishop, and if your opponent moves over to h8, we have an amazing sacrifice with bishop takes h6. And if they capture back, we have checkmate in one with queen takes h6. And if they don't capture, we're going to be checkmating them in a similar fashion where we move the bishop, and now the queen is delivering checkmate here. What they may do to try and defend is play something like bishop to g4. And the idea is that after you capture here, they can take your bishop. I mean, still you're going to be much better in this position, but let's keep the pressure on with queen h4 and still with threatening checkmate like this. After something like knight to g6, we can capture in g4. And after they take here, we can take the knight, and we're completely winning. So pretty much any way that we play this, we're going to be in a really great position here. Now, let's look at a couple of the other potential responses, just in case. If your opponent does not decide to castle and they decide to play f6, then here we're going to play queen h5. And after g6, blocking off the check, we have a nice move with bishop f7 check. After the king moves to d7, we're going to give them a check with the queen. And after they block with the pawn, we're going to play the move knight to e6. And here we're attacking the queen, and the queen is actually trapped on these squares. There's no square that it can go to because our knight and our bishop control all of its escape squares at the moment. So that's a nice queen trap that we'll see there. Okay, so let's look at one final trap, and this one's pretty crazy. So what your opponent may play after bishop to b5 is one of the moves that we saw earlier, but in a different order. So knight g to e7 is known as the Cozio defense, and a lot of the time here they'll plan to fianchetto their bishop by playing g6 and bringing their bishop out to the g7 square and then castling over here. So again, this move is just stopping you from doubling the pawns on c6. If you capture here, they'll take back with the knight. So here, we're going to play the move c3. As we've seen it many times before, planning to play d4. After d6, g4, and bishop d7, breaking the pin on the knight to the king. After castles here, a popular move is to play knight g6, and the idea is that they want to put this knight down on the f4 square, which is a really strong square for the knight to sit because it controls so many squares around the king. Here we're going to play the move knight to g5, and here we're attacking this f7 pawn, and your opponent may look at this move and think, alright, you don't have a bishop on c4, you're not threatening to take here, so I'm just going to kick your knight away, and you're going to have to go back to f3 or h3, and then you've just wasted a move. But here we're going to surprise them with something a little bit crazy, and we're going to sacrifice on f7. This is a little bit of a dubious sacrifice, so this is a bit more of a trick rather than a very solid response here. So this is one of the only responses that I'm giving that is a little bit crazy, but it's super fun. You can catch an opponent off guard with this a lot. So after the king takes on f7, we're going to give a check with bishop c4. So after bishop c4, the opponent has 3 squares that they can go to, e7, f6, or e8. And you have to make a rather quick decision in what is going to be the best square. Now, king f6 immediately looks bad, and I doubt that you're going to see this very often. For example, after queen f3, if the king decides to retreat back now, we have queen to e7 checkmate over here. And really the only move that they can do is put this knight in front of the king and allow us to just capture and open everything up. And this just looks way too crazy. So another move you might consider is king to e8 and king to e7. And on an initial look, it may seem like king to e7 could be the best move, because after king to e8, we get ourselves into a little bit of trouble after queen h5 with some pins on the king. But king to e7 is exactly what we want. Now we're going to play the move queen h5, attacking the knight. And here your opponent may notice if they move the knight, then they're going to be checkmated on f7. So they have to defend the knight in some way. So if your opponent decides to defend with queen e8, there is a very surprising checkmate that comes out after this with the move queen to g5. And we have an amazing queen sacrifice here. And after the h-pawn captures, we have bishop takes g5 and a checkmate with the 2 bishops controlling the only escape squares. So this is just such an amazing checkmate to see. If your opponent instead defends with bishop to e8, which looks like it may make more sense rather than bringing the queen back, again, we have a similar idea. This time, we're going to give a check with the bishop. Bishop g5, and after the pawn takes, queen g5, king d7, and queen g4, king e7, and queen e6 is checkmate. If your opponent instead decides to defend with this bishop by bringing it back to e8, we again have a checkmate, but this time do not sacrifice your queen because they can just take it and run away this time. So don't sacrifice your queen this time. Because after you take here and the rook takes here, they're just going to be up 4 points of material. So instead, what we're going to play is bishop to g5, sacrificing a piece again, so we still get the cool style points. And after takes, king d7, queen f5, king e7, we have a checkmate over here on e6 with the queen and the bishop working together. So those are the two potential checkmates. What your opponent should do after queen h5 is just let that knight go and allow you to capture here. So the best move according to the engine is to play queen c8 and allow the queen to capture this knight and make a checkmate threat. And the idea is that after takes, the king is going to retreat to d8. So this is a little bit of a crazy sequence to find. So I think that you'll be able to catch a lot of people with this trap. So let me know if any of these traps or beginner mistakes do come up in your games and if you're able to use them to your advantage. Even if you don't find these specific traps in your games, it's always fun to learn these kind of patterns and some of the crazy stuff that can happen out of the opening when you're least expecting it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and let me know if you'd like to see similar sort of videos with some other openings. Thank you very much and bye.